All eyes on Georgia's special Senate runoffs happening tomorrow. The two races, of course, will determine which party controls the Senate. Republicans only need to win one of those races to prevent Democrats from controlling both chambers of Congress to give President-elect Joe Biden to go ahead on some of those more progressive policy proposals. So here to discuss the significance of those races with us is Lanhee Chen, Hoover Institution Fellow and former Mitt Romney 2012 Policy Advisor as well. And Lanhee, I appreciate you coming on here to chat. We've been seeing odds. If you look at the betting markets here, we always watch markets, but we've been seeing odds that the Democrats in these races might win. We've seen those rise the last couple of weeks here. Now the favorites in those betting markets. So what do you make of the way this race is shaken out, particularly when we consider the actions from President Trump and how that might weigh on Republican voters in the state of Georgia?
Well, a couple of factors are important to consider. First of all, when you've got a special runoff election like this, the turnout question is always truly significant. The mix of voters you have, you've got to motivate voters, mobilize voters. And it really does come down to which side has the better ground game, has the better mobilization efforts to get people to get their voters to the polls. And both sides have reasons to be optimistic. Republicans have contacted each possible likely voter in their universe 10 times. There have been 1,000 paid staffers on the ground. Democrats feel good given where the early vote has been coming from so far. And I think that the sense for Democrats is if they can turn this into an election where they take some of that momentum from the presidential contest in November and translate it over, they've got a shot. Now, the bigger question is how President Trump, as you noted, affects all of this. Obviously, President Trump is the great motivator for many Republicans. He's also the great motivator for many Democrats. So that is a factor. We won't really know kind of how he plays, how Biden plays until we get to Election Day tomorrow and have some results.
President Trump may be the great motivator, Lanhee, but he has single-handedly over the last few months been saying that, look, the election system is not fair, that there are some elements of fraud, that it is rigged. I mean, how do the Republicans try to mobilize voters when you've got a president telling them don't really trust the system?
That makes it very complicated. That makes it challenging, Akiko, to say the least. Look, I think when you've got the president who has the potential to motivate Republican voters sending mixed messages, on the one hand saying, turn out to vote, vote by mail. On the other hand, the system is rigged, and I actually won Georgia. Those messages end up being a challenge. So there's no question Republicans in this situation have been swimming upstream because of some of the president's rhetoric, because of where the president has been in terms of continuing to challenge the election results. And by the way, the epicenter of that is Georgia. We know from over the weekend with reporting and actual recordings of a president's call with Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia, basically asking him to overturn the election unilaterally. That kind of reporting and that kind of information does not necessarily give a lot of confidence to Republican voters. So that may add to Democratic enthusiasm in terms of their ability to do well in this race.
Yeah, Lanhee, I mean, when we talk about, the momentum here, right, because that's generally one of those things we watched leading up to the election. Democrats have been gaining momentum in the polls. And particularly, I mean, when you think about the idea that maybe, Senate control might encourage Republicans to get out to the polls, I'd be curious to know, what your take is on that, because it seems like it would be a pretty weak motivator rather than getting behind a candidate that you actually want to see in office.
Yeah, well, look, both sides have nationalized the race. Republicans are saying that this will be the difference between, moving toward far left-wing progressive policies and keeping the country on a more moderate course. And Democrats are arguing the only way to effectuate Biden's agenda, the only way to ensure there is change from the Trump era is to vote Democrat. So nationalizing this race, it's interesting. Usually these runoff elections end up being very local in nature. They come down to relatively parochial issues. Both sides are basically trying to argue how they're better for Georgia. In this case, Georgia voters have been bombarded with the message that what they do affects the national political scene. It affects the national policy scene. We'll see what it ends up doing for turnout. My guess is Georgia voters know exactly how important this election is. I do think turnout for a runoff in particular is going to be relatively high. And it just comes down to whose voters come out. Is it Democrats or Republicans? That will determine who wins one or both of these races.
Lanhee, beyond Tuesday, there's going to be a lot of attention on that joint session of Congress on Wednesday with a group of Republican lawmakers saying that they are pushing to delay the counting of these electoral votes. A number of I don't know if we even want to call them the former Republicans, those like Steve Schmidt, a strategist for John McCain, coming out and saying that this is the beginning of a divided Republican Party, that Republican Party as we know it is no longer going to survive. You heard former House Speaker Paul Ryan, who you worked very closely with back in 2012, saying it's difficult to conceive a more anti-democratic, anti-conservative act than intervention to overturn the results of state-certified elections. You've got your ears on the ground there within the party. What's the conversation right now, and how does the Republican Party move beyond this election?
Well, I do think you are seeing divisions in the Republican Party. I certainly think that you're seeing it now amongst some more prominent Republicans in terms of how they're addressing this question of what Trump is trying to do. You have on the one hand people like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley who've basically said, look, we're going to double down on the president's rhetoric. We're going to double down on this notion that the election potential irregularities, whatever you want to call them, they have to be investigated. And then you've got other Republicans like Mitt Romney basically saying, look, this is madness. What's going on here? My sense is that a lot of this is going to play out over the next few years, that as Republicans begin to figure out who will lead the party after Trump, and I do think that Trump will recede to a certain degree, not completely, but to a certain degree, Republicans are going to have to figure out what leadership of the party looks like. And I do think there will be a real contest. It may not be resolved, by the way, until the 2024 presidential primary. And I think this is the very early jockeying we are seeing between people who might want to run for president in a couple of years, this sort of jockeying over how best to position themselves in light of what the president has done. This is the opening salvo of the 2024 Republican presidential primary campaign.